Does delaying the restructuring plan really give Evergrande a bit more time to potentially be able to negotiate signed deals at this point?
Yes, I think the delay is not exactly the surprise to the market, given the company has some negative development recently about the resignation of the CFO and the CEO. At the same time, some of the onshore creditors said they're not willing to extend the bond maturity. So I think all this is happening before this self-imposed delay of their announcement. But I think the announcement, if it happens, will be quite a milestone for the high-yield property bond, because it probably will set a template for the restructuring of other defaulted developers. I think a lot of the investors are very closely watching a few issues, the recovery ratio, the government involvement, the treatment of offshore bondholders, as well as some of the details in terms of asset sales. So overall, this is still a quite big event to watch for.
What are you watching out for when we finally do get the details of the deal?
I think first is in terms of some of the details of the restructuring, such as the new coupon rate, new maturity extension, the installment schedule. Then is the government involvement, both the central government and local government, in terms of how they assist the asset sales and the involvement of some of the state-linked companies. And then, of course, we are also closely watching the treatment of offshore bondholders, especially some of the keep well bonds, and the payment waterfall in terms of who will get paid first. Is it the supplier? Is this the home buyers with the down payment? Or is it some of the bondholders, whether it's onshore or offshore?
Zerlina, you continue to mention government involvement. Does this give us more reassurances about the property sector that we will not see systemic risks despite the fact that we see continued mortgage boycotts?
I think at the moment, our base case scenario is we don't see elevated systemic risk for a few reasons. The first is the government is involving, and their action has been quite swift, both from the central government and the local government. Second is we think the China's banking system is relatively well capitalized. And third, we don't see right now the default is contagious to the other sectors outside the property. But of course, we are seeing still very elevated property risk for the Chinese economy. It is likely going to be a drag on the economy in the second half of the year still. And if we have a bear case scenario here, then we are going to see some risk emerging from the smaller banks as well as along the supply chain of the property sector.
Which is why you're saying you're staying cautious on China high-yield developers. What about some of the industrial names? Could we see a spillover?
I think so far we are not seeing the spillover in terms of default risk. But of course, moving ahead, we think there's going to be very high elevated trading volatility. Some of the high-yield industrial names, they have been sold off in the past because of some headline risks. I think this is going to continue in the second half of the year. And in terms of their funding costs, a lot of privately owned high-yield industrial names, they still have a much worse access to funding, both onshore and offshore. Their dollar bond funding cost has been very high. So I think even though at the moment we don't see elevated contagion risk, but the volatility is going to stay here.
Zerlina, what did you get out of the Politburo meeting in terms of the government and policymakers' intent on how they plan to address these issues in the property sector?
Yeah, sure. I think they are still standing very firm in terms of housing as for living, not for speculation. This bottom line has not really changed. But we do see the government is trying to improve some of the transmission of the stimulus policies pushed out in the first half of the year. We could see they are trying to encourage banks, also asset management companies, to extend some support to the property sector. They are also emphasizing that they are going to ensure the home delivery to ensure the social stability. Of course, other aspect of the Politburo meeting is also about transmission and implementation, such as infrastructure policy, directing credit to the real economy, as well as addressing some of the unemployment issues, especially in the youth sector. So even though I think there's no big ticket infrastructure, additional stimulus measures pushing out, but the focus here is really about transmission and implementation.